My grandmother never gave me financial advice, not once. She never sat me down and explained how to manage money, how to save, how to spend, how to think about the relationship between what comes in and what goes out. She just lived. And the way she lived was so consistent, so quietly competent, and so fundamentally different from the way most people I know live that I spent years trying to reverse engineer what she was actually doing. This video is the result of that. 7 habits she practiced without ever explaining them. 7 things I watched her do my entire childhood that I now understand were not quirks or generational preferences. They were a complete and coherent way of managing a household that produced, over decades, a life that looked and felt richer than its income would suggest. Before I get into them, this is going to be a long video, not because I am padding it out, because these ideas deserve to be explained properly rather than compressed into a listicle that you forget 10 minutes after watching. If you give it your full attention, I think it will be worth considerably more than something you half-watched at double speed. The first habit is what I can only describe as total food awareness. My grandmother knew exactly what was in her kitchen at all times. Not approximately, not sort of, exactly. She could tell you, without opening a single cupboard, what was on every shelf, how much of it remained when it had come in, and roughly how long before it needed to be used. This was not a special skill. It was the natural result of a habit she had practiced so long it had become unconscious. Everything that came into the kitchen was noted. Everything that left the kitchen was used completely before its replacement arrived. Nothing sat in the back of a cupboard forgotten until it was no longer good. Nothing was bought in bulk beyond what could realistically be used before it turned. The kitchen was a managed system, not a storage space, and the financial consequence of that was that almost nothing was wasted. The average American household throws away approximately $1,500 worth of food every year. That number is not primarily the result of buying too much or carrying too little. It is primarily the result of not knowing what you have. Food bought without awareness of what is already there. Food pushed to the back of the refrigerator by newer arrivals and forgotten until it is too late. Food that was always intended to be used but never made it into a meal because nobody tracked whether it was there or remembered it existed. My grandmother did not have this problem because she never lost track of what she had. The practice she used was physical and spatial. Older items always at the front, newer items always at the back. Nothing placed where it could not be seen. Nothing stored without being noted. The system is called first in, first out, and it costs nothing to implement. It requires one afternoon to reorganize a refrigerator and a pantry, and it eliminates the majority of food waste that most households generate, not through discipline or willpower, but through simple physical arrangement that makes forgetting structurally difficult. Beyond the organization, my grandmother cooked in a way that left almost no remainder. A chicken produced a meal, then stock from the carcass, then soup from the stock. Vegetable ends went into a jar in the cool part of the kitchen, and at the end of the week, they became broth. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or a thickener for something else. Nothing with any remaining nutritional value left the kitchen unused. This was not elaborate. It did not require special skills or extra time. It required the habit of asking, before anything was discarded, whether it had actually finished being useful. Most of the time, the answer was no, and the money saved from not replacing what had been wasted was money that stayed in the household without effort. The second habit is the one that I think most directly separates my grandmother's generation of Japanese homemakers from the way most people in wealthy countries currently live. She repaired things, not occasionally, not as a last resort after replacement had been considered and rejected, as a first instinct. The automatic response to something breaking or wearing out was not to replace it. It was to look at it, diagnose what specifically had failed, and fix that specific thing. A coat with a torn lining was not a coat that needed replacing. It was a coat that needed 20 minutes and a needle and thread. A shoe with a worn sole was not a shoe that was finished. It was a shoe that needed resoling. A pot with a cracked handle was not a pot to discard. It was a pot to be used without the handle, or fitted with a new one, or whose metal would eventually be repurposed for something else entirely. Nothing left the household while it retained any function. The financial logic of repair versus replacement is simple but consistently ignored in modern consumer culture. Repairing a jacket costs $20, replacing it costs $200. Repairing an appliance costs $100, replacing it costs $600. Maintaining a car properly costs $2,000 over 5 years. Replacing it costs $40,000. Across every category of household goods, repair costs between 10 and 30% of replacement, and the gap between those numbers, accumulated across every item in a household over years, is not a small number. It is the difference between a household that always feels financially stretched and one that does not. The planned obsolescence model that dominates modern consumer goods manufacturing was specifically designed to make this arithmetic invisible. Products engineered to a lifespan that produces a replacement cycle, replacement parts made deliberately difficult to source, repair manuals not published. The entire system oriented toward making replacement feel more natural than repair. My grandmother operated outside the system, not through any deliberate rejection of it, but because the instinct to repair was so deeply embedded in her that the replacement reflex never developed. She saw a broken thing and reached for a way to fix it. The application today requires only a change in the default question. Before anything gets replaced, the question is not, what should I buy to replace this? The question is, what specifically has failed in this, and is that fixable? The answer, far more often than the modern default assumes, is yes. The third habit is what she did with clothing, and it is the most directly countercultural thing on this list given the current state of the fashion industry. She owned very little. What she owned was good quality. She wore it for years. When something showed wear, she mended it. When something was beyond mending, it became something else. A cleaning cloth, a piece for a quilt, stuffing for a cushion. Nothing left the clothing category while it retained any use. Her wardrobe fit in one closet. It always had. Not because she had never had more, but because she had never kept more than she genuinely used. The average American currently buys 68 pieces of clothing per year. The average garment is worn 7 times before being discarded. Most people have wardrobes full of clothing they do not wear, alongside the daily experience of feeling like they have nothing to wear. This is not a paradox. It is the predictable result of accumulation without curation. When a wardrobe contains everything, nothing stands out. When it contains only what is actually worn and actually works, getting dressed becomes simple. My grandmother's version of this was not minimalism as an aesthetic choice. It was the natural result of taking ownership seriously. She bought something when she needed it. She bought it at the quality level required for it to last. She cared for it properly so that it did last, and she wore it until it was genuinely finished. The financial implication of this across a lifetime is significant, not because any individual purchase was cheaper, because the total number of purchases was dramatically lower. She did not spend less per item. She spent on fewer items. And the items she spent on, cared for properly, lasted long enough to justify the cost many times over. The fourth habit is the one that requires the least behavior change and produces some of the most immediate results. She tracked every dollar. Not digitally, not with an app. With a small notebook that she kept in a specific drawer in the kitchen and wrote in every evening, every expense from the day, written by hand in categories, reviewed at the end of every week, reflected on at the end of every month. I found that notebook once when I was young and did not understand what I was looking at. Now I understand it was the most important financial tool she owned. The practice has a name, Kakebo, and I have talked about it in a previous video on this channel, but I want to revisit it here from a different angle, specifically the angle of why handwriting matters in a way that digital tracking does not. When you tap a card or click to purchase something online, the transaction feels like nothing. The money is invisible. The brain does not register a real loss in the same way it does when you physically hand over cash. This invisibility is not accidental. The entire infrastructure of modern payment systems has been deliberately designed to remove the friction from the act of spending. Every design choice that makes paying faster, easier, and less noticeable is a design choice that increases spending. Writing an expense in a notebook reintroduces friction. Not a lot, just enough. You write the words, you write the number. For a moment, the transaction is visible and real in a way that a number changing on a screen is not. And that moment of visibility changes behavior. Studies consistently show that people who track spending manually spend between 15 and 20% less than people who do not. Not because they restrict themselves more, because they can see what they are doing. And you cannot keep making the same unconscious choice once it is written in your own handwriting. And you have to look at it. My grandmother's notebook was not a budget in the modern sense. She did not set spending limits for categories and measure herself against them. She simply kept a record of what moved through the household, what came in, what went out, and where it went. That record, reviewed consistently, made invisible patterns visible. Invisible patterns get changed in a way that invisible ones do not. The fifth habit is the relationship she had with new things, specifically how slowly she acquired them. This is harder to describe than the others because it was not a rule she followed. It was a quality of attention. Before anything new came into the household, she thought about it, not briefly. For long enough that the impulse behind the desire had time to settle into something more honest. She was almost never the first person to buy anything. She watched things sit in shops. She thought about whether she actually needed them. She considered what they would replace, where they would go, how they would be maintained, and whether she would genuinely be better off with them than without them. Most of the time, the conclusion was that she would not. Not because the things were bad, because her life was already calibrated and a new thing would require adjustment rather than simply slotting in. The 30-day pause that I have talked about in other videos on this channel was not a practice she followed deliberately. It was her natural relationship with acquisition. She did not fight impulses, she just did not act on them quickly. And by the time she had thought about something long enough to feel settled in a decision, most impulses had already faded. The financial consequence of this is that she bought significantly less than most people with similar circumstances. Not because she denied herself things she genuinely wanted, because she was honest over a 30-day period of thinking about it, but whether she actually wanted most things. And usually she did not. The things she did buy were bought with complete intention. She knew why she was buying them, what they would do, where they would go, and how long she expected them to last. Those purchases stayed. They served their purpose. They were not replaced until they were genuinely finished. The sixth habit is the one that most directly reflects the Japanese philosophy of simplicity as a value rather than a constraint. She kept her home clear, not in the sense of empty or sterile. Clear in the sense that nothing was in the house that did not have a clear reason to be there. Every surface had been decided about. Every drawer contained things that were used. Every room had a function, and the things in it supported that function without competing with it. Nothing accumulated because nothing was allowed to accumulate, not through constant vigilance, through a consistent habit of deciding every time something came in whether it genuinely deserved to be there, and a consistent habit of dealing with things promptly rather than letting the decision pile up until dealing with it required a dedicated project. The financial dimension of this is not immediately obvious, but it is real. A household where everything is known and placed and used has lower hidden costs than a household where things accumulate unnoticed. You do not buy duplicates of things you already have if you know what you have. You do not pay for storage of things you're not using if you do not keep things you are not using. You do not replace things you have forgotten you own. And the cognitive cost of managing a complicated household, the low-level mental drain of always knowing there is more to deal with than you have dealt with, is a real cost, even if it does not appear on any statement. My grandmother's home felt restful in a way I could not identify as a child. I understand it now. It was restful because nothing in it was asking for attention it was not going to get. Everything was managed, and a managed environment, regardless of its size or cost, produces a sense of control and sufficiency that an unmanaged environment cannot replicate regardless of how much was spent filling it. The seventh habit is the most difficult to explain because it is not a practice in the narrow sense. It is an orientation. My grandmother was not frugal because she was anxious about money. She was not careful about spending because scarcity had made her fearful. She was precise about everything she owned and spent because she had a genuine sense of what was enough. Not enough as a ceiling, enough as a destination. A clearly understood point at which she had what she needed, lived how she wanted to live, and did not feel the pull of more. Most financial advice assumes that the goal is to maximize more savings, more investment, more financial security. And these things are not wrong, but they are incomplete without a sense of what enough looks like. Because without that, the pursuit of more is genuinely endless. You can make more than you make now and still feel like it is not enough. You can save more than you save now and still feel financially anxious. Not because you're failing, because you have never defined the finish line. My grandmother had defined it. She knew what her life needed to contain for her to feel that it was full. And because she knew that, she was not in pursuit of anything beyond it. She was not denying herself. She was not restraining herself through discipline. She simply did not want most of what she did not have, because what she had was enough. And knowing that, really knowing it in the bones, not just as a concept, is the most financially powerful thing a person can have. Not a high income, not a large savings balance, not a sophisticated investment strategy. The knowledge of what is enough. Everything else follows from that. These 7 habits, total food awareness, repair as a first instinct, a small and well-managed wardrobe, handwritten expense tracking, slow and intentional acquisition, a clear and managed home, and a genuine sense of enough, were never presented to me as financial strategy. They were just how my grandmother lived, day after day, decade after decade, without announcement or instruction. The result, over a lifetime, was a kind of stability and sufficiency that people with significantly higher incomes often spend their whole lives trying to achieve and never quite reaching. Not because she earned more, because she wasted less, owned deliberately, and knew when she had enough. If someone in your life has always lived this way, quietly, precisely, without apparent effort or deprivation, I would genuinely like to hear about them in the comments. Those people are worth paying attention to. And as always, I would rather you watch this once and think about it properly than watch it twice at double speed. Until next time.